Welcome to an unforgettable story that will challenge your thoughts on fairness, entitlement, and the power of standing up for yourself. In this gripping tale, we witness a tense encounter between a mother, her child, and a man simply trying to enjoy his flight. What happens when privilege meets resistance at 30,000 feet? Will justice prevail, or will entitlement win the day? If you enjoy thought-provoking stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more compelling content. Your support helps bring more stories to life and spark important conversations. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for a journey unlike any other. James Carter sat by the airplane window, looking out at the busy runway of Chicago O'Hare International Airport. He adjusted his glasses and took a deep breath, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. It had been years since he last flew home to Atlanta. His job as an IT specialist kept him busy, and he hardly had time to visit family. But this trip was special. His mother's 60th birthday was coming up, and he had promised to be there. The plane was filling up quickly. Passengers walked down the aisle, stuffing their bags in the overhead bins and settling into their seats. James looked around, noticing the usual mix of travelers, businessmen in suits, families with children, and solo travelers like himself. He sighed, hoping for a quiet flight. Just as he was getting comfortable, a mother and her young son appeared beside him. The woman, a blonde-haired woman in her mid-30s, had an expensive designer bag slung over her shoulder. Her son, a boy around 6 years old, clutched a small toy airplane in his hands. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice polite but firm. "I think you're in our seat." James frowned and glanced at his ticket. "I don't think so," he said, holding it up. "I have 14A. The woman sighed heavily. "No, you don't understand," she said. "I booked 14A and 14B for myself and my son. He needs to sit by the window." James raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, I also booked this seat. I checked in early." The woman's polite smile faltered, and a look of irritation crossed her face. "Look," she said, lowering her voice as if trying to sound reasonable. "My son gets very anxious during flights. He needs the window seat. Would you mind moving?" James hesitated. He wasn't a confrontational person, and he didn't want to make a scene. But this was his assigned seat. He had chosen the window seat for a reason. Besides, he had paid for it just like anyone else. "I'm sorry," he said, shaking his head, "but this is my seat." The woman's face hardened. "Oh, come on," she said, her voice rising. "It's just a seat. Can't you be considerate? My son is scared of flying. Don't you have any compassion?" James clenched his jaw, feeling the stares of nearby passengers. Some looked away, pretending not to listen, while others watched with quiet interest. He hated being put in this position. "I do understand," he said calmly, "but I also paid for this seat. If it was that important, maybe you should have booked seats differently." The woman let out an exasperated laugh. "Wow, unbelievable." She turned to her son, who was now staring up at James with wide eyes. "See, honey? Some people just don't care about others." James felt a wave of frustration. This wasn't about kindness. It was about entitlement. Before he could say anything else, the woman turned toward the aisle and waved at a flight attendant. "Excuse me, she called out. A flight attendant, a middle-aged woman with a professional yet warm demeanor, walked over. "Is there a problem here?" "Yes," the mother said, her voice dripping with righteous indignation. "This man is refusing to move so my son can have the window seat. He's scared of flying. and I asked politely. But he's being difficult. The flight attendant looked at James, then at the woman and her son. James held his breath, expecting her to tell him to move. Instead, she said something that shocked everyone. "Ma'am, this gentleman has every right to stay in his assigned seat. If you need accommodations, I can check if there's another window seat available. Otherwise, I kindly ask that you take your assigned seats." The woman's mouth dropped open. But he's being unreasonable. My son needs that seat." "I understand your concern," the flight attendant said, keeping her tone firm but calm. "But fairness applies to everyone. He booked this seat. If you needed a specific arrangement, it should have been done at the time of booking." A few passengers murmured in agreement. James felt a mixture of relief and admiration for the flight attendant's professionalism. But the mother wasn't giving up easily. "You're seriously taking his side?" she demanded. "This is unbelievable. I thought airlines cared about their passengers, especially children." "We do," the flight attendant said smoothly, "which is why we have procedures in place to accommodate requests ahead of time. Unfortunately, we can't ask someone to give up their seat just because you demand it." The woman huffed and turned to James. "Fine. I hope you can sleep at night knowing you ruined a child's flight." James bit his tongue. He wasn't about to argue with someone who clearly believed she was entitled to whatever she wanted. Instead, he simply turned back to his window, ignoring her glare as she finally took her seat beside her son. The flight attendant nodded at James before walking away. James exhaled deeply, his heartbeat still racing from the encounter. He had experienced subtle prejudice before, but this was different. The entitlement, the expectation that he would simply comply, it left a bitter taste in his mouth. And as the plane prepared for takeoff, he couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. The plane had reached cruising altitude, but the tension between James and the woman beside him was just taking off. James adjusted his seatbelt and took out his book, determined to ignore the hostility radiating from the woman. Her son sat quietly, playing with his toy airplane, seemingly unaware of the battle his mother had waged. After about 20 minutes, the woman let out an exaggerated sigh and muttered under her breath, "This is ridiculous." James pretended not to hear, flipping the page of his book. But she wasn't finished. "You know, it wouldn't have killed you to switch," she said, turning slightly toward him. "It's not like I was asking for a kidney. Just a seat." James took a deep breath and set his book down. "Ma'am, I understand that you wanted the seat for your son, but I also paid for this seat. I'm not doing anything wrong by sitting here." She scoffed. "I hope you never find yourself in a position where you need someone's kindness." James looked at her, his patience wearing thin. Kindness should be mutual. "I wasn't unkind. I was fair." She let out a short, sarcastic laugh. "Fairness? Sure." James turned back to his book, but he could feel the weight of her anger. He knew this flight was going to feel much longer than 2 hours. A few rows behind them, an older woman with silver hair and sharp, observant eyes had been listening. She had seen many things in her life, things that taught her to recognize injustice, no matter how subtle. And she had heard enough. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, moving gracefully down the aisle toward James and the woman. "Excuse me," she said, her voice warm yet firm. "I couldn't help but overhear. Young man, you handled yourself with grace. And ma'am, entitlement is not a good look on you." The woman's eyes widened. "Excuse me?" "I said what I said. The older woman crossed her arms. "You asked?" He declined. "And yet here you are, making a scene. It's time to let it go." James looked at the older woman, surprised but grateful. Finally, he had an ally in this fight. The mother's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced around, realizing more passengers were watching than she had thought. The weight of their silent judgment settled over her, and her face turned red with embarrassment. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something more, but instead, she crossed her arms and turned toward the window. Her son, oblivious to the tension, continued to play with his toy plane, humming softly. The older woman who had spoken up before, now standing beside James, gave him a reassuring smile. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "People like that expect the world to bow to them." James nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you for stepping in," he replied. "I appreciate it." The older woman patted his shoulder gently before returning to her seat. Minutes later, the flight attendant returned, this time with a warm smile. "Mr. Carter, we actually do have a complimentary upgrade available in first class. Would you like to take it?" James hesitated for a second, then smiled. "That sounds great." As he gathered his belongings, he turned to the little boy and said, "You have a good flight, kiddo." The boy grinned and waved. The mother's expression soured even further as James moved to the front of the plane. He could hear whispers and see smirks from nearby passengers who had been watching the entire exchange. As James settled into his spacious new seat, he took a deep breath and smiled. Some battles weren't worth fighting, but standing his ground had been the right decision. Fairness wasn't about convenience. It was about principle. The plane soared higher, leaving behind more than just the runway. For James, this flight had become about something bigger than a seat. It was about dignity, respect, and the importance of standing up for oneself, even at 30,000 feet.